late, but we'll be able to extend the time to 5:45 and divide it into the 2 hours. For the first hour, we have from the Office of the Auditor General, Karen Hogan, the Auditor General, Andrew Hayes, Deputy Auditor General, and Nicholas Wales, Principal. You are familiar with this committee, so we don't need to do instructions. And you've already warned me that you might be a second or two over 5 minutes. But nevertheless, in the great discretion of the chair, I'm perfectly prepared to allow that, given you're the Auditor General. So thank you, and please, we'll look forward to what you have to say.
Thank you. I'll try to speak fast, and I apologize to the translators now so I can squeeze it all in. Mr. Chair, thank you for this opportunity to appear before your committee as part of its study on procurement processes and their impact on the readiness of the Canadian Armed Forces. I would like to acknowledge that this hearing is taking place on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. Joining me today is Andrew Hayes, my Deputy Auditor General, as well as Nick Swales. He is a principal who is really our expert on national defense matters and has done many audits on procurement. There are a number of themes emerging from our audits linked to defense procurement that I would like to highlight for the committee. First, I will speak to delays and scope changes and the impact they have on the timely renewal of fleets. When fleet renewal is delayed, aging aircraft and ships remain in service beyond their planned useful lives or are retired before replacements are operational. Keeping aging aircraft and ships in service also means increased operating and maintenance costs. In 2021, we audited the National Shipbuilding Strategy, which was launched in 2010. It calls for the building of different classes of at least 50 large science and defense vessels over some 30 years. Overall, we found that the delivery of many ships had been significantly delayed because of challenges in design and construction. For example, welding problems were discovered in the offshore fishery science vessels, which required time to investigate and repair. This delayed construction schedules for other vessels, increasing the risk of not having the vessels ready to do what you need when you need to do it. Our recent audit of the surveillance of Canada's Arctic waters, which this committee studied in December 2022, found that delays and their impacts persist. The audit also found risks of gaps in surveillance, patrol, and presence capabilities because of aging satellites and patrol aircraft that may also reach the end of their useful lives before replacements are available. The replacement of Canada's fighters force is another example of delays and their impacts on readiness. Canada bought its CF-18s in the early 1980s, expecting to replace them after about 20 years of service, but this did not happen. In 2016, the government directed National Defence to have enough fighter aircraft available every day to meet the highest NORAD alert level and Canada's NATO commitment at the same time. This meant that National Defence had to increase by 23% the number of fighter aircraft available for operations. To meet the demand, the government purchased used fighter jets from Australia that were about 30 years old and had the same operational limitations as Canada's fleet of CF-18s.
This brings me to the second theme I wish to highlight. If you don't have the people for the use and upkeep of the equipment, the readiness problem remains. In the case of Canada's fighter jets, National Defence expected to spend about $3 billion to buy and operate the Australian aircraft and to extend the life of its fleet. However, it did not have a plan to deal with the shortage of experienced pilots and the CF-18's declining combat capability. Purchasing additional aircraft was not enough to meet both the NORAD and NATO requirements together. In 2022, as part of our update on past audits, we found that National Defence had increased its number of aircraft and pilots available for operations, but not its technicians. As National Defence was still implementing its recruitment and retention strategies, some positions had yet to be staffed. The final theme I wish to bring to your attention today is inventory management. We have been raising this as an issue through our financial audit work for some 20 years now. We further examined the military supply chain in a performance audit in 2020. We found that military units received material such as spare parts, uniforms, and rations late 50% of the time. High priority items needed to satisfy critical operational requirements were late, and even more often, at 60% of the time. These delays, often brought about by stock shortages, affected National Defence's capacity to perform its duties and manage its resources efficiently. These audits underscore the importance of supplying Canada's military and renewing fleets in a timely manner to avoid capability gaps that may jeopardize Canada's ability to meet its domestic and international obligations for science and defense. Mr. Chair, this concludes my opening remarks. I would be pleased to answer any questions the committee may have. Thank you.
Madam Auditor General, Mr. Kelly, 6 minutes.
Thank you. In your report of 2021 that you mentioned in your opening statement, you say at 2.14, the delivery of many ships was significantly delayed, and further delays could result in several vessels being retired before new vessels are operational. Is that still the case? Have steps been taken since your report to rectify that?
Well, we did look, I guess, on the periphery when we did our work on the surveillance of Arctic waters. And from the shipbuilding strategy audit, we noted that there were delays and that there was very little wiggle room for further delays to happen. When we looked at surveillance of Arctic waters, we found that those delays have persisted. And in that report, I would actually point you to an exhibit that we have where we actually show sort of when the useful lives of ships were supposed to end, how they might be extended, and when new ones are expected. And if something isn't done, there could be a gap in surveillance capabilities and in availability of equipment if national defense doesn't address the issues of untimely.
What about accountability and ministerial accountability? We heard from the parliamentary budget officer about the mixed accountability between multiple departments. Would a single minister make a difference and be a helpful way to better control these projects?
Mm-hmm. And when I look back at all of our work, I don't think that we ever found anything in our work that pointed that would be that would bubble up to the top as one of the key risks to address. I must admit that personally I'm not too fussed whether it's one department or many departments that are involved. What is really needed in a procurement process is the right skill set. This isn't about buying boots, right? You need some specialized expertise.
Does PSPC possess that specialized skill?
I think they are experts in procurement, and that's where you need the combination of sort of defense and the needs from national defense. So, you know, if you had one entity, you would have to make sure that it had all the skills that entity needed and the expertise to make those decisions.
Does it exist presently?
I think when you look at the combination of the armed forces, national defense, and PSPC, yes, they have the skills. The lack of timely decisions, I think, is rooted in other places. I would point to.
Okay, where?
So I think I would point to a few things. I would say that there's really not very good life cycle planning when it comes to military procurement. The gaps that the country is potentially facing didn't sneak up on Canada. You knew that there would be a useful life to a ship or to an airplane, and so planning ahead for that needs to be better done. I would then point to the complexity of the procurement processes. So it isn't it isn't just about buying a good anymore. Many of the procurements are trying to accomplish many things, whether they are about creating an industry in the shipbuilding case, or trying to have economic benefits come out of procurements. There's a trade-off when you try to accomplish many things in a procurement. And I think finally I would point to not really having a stable outcome. Right? So what should the Canadian Forces look like, and what does it need? There needs to be better consensus about that across the government.
Your very specific recommendations was 2.46 about the public service and procurement Canada should improve risk management tools at the National Shipbuilding Strategies Management level to enable thorough risk analysis, specific time-bound and measurable risk mitigation, and better monitoring and implementation of the risk mitigation measures. The department agreed. Have they implemented any of these recommendations?
I'm going to have to ask Nick if he might want to jump in on that. We have not followed up further than seeing the detailed action plan that they would have provided to the Public Accounts Committee when we had a hearing. But agreeing and figuring out that contracting relationship and agreeing how to share risks, I think, is something that is essential to speeding up the procurement process. There is benefit to offloading some risk, but then that risk needs to be offloaded if that's the case, and not taken back on by the government. So there's merit in trying to refine that and working that out better.
Is risk aversion born of maybe lack of expertise at the lower levels of PSPC? Does this contribute to delay?
I'm not sure I would point to risk aversion being what's contributing to delays. I think it is about moving outcome, changing of priorities and objectives. And when you take time to make a decision, then technology changes, and so then you need to revisit. So it's a bit of a cycle. More timely decision making and knowing what the intended outcome, I think, would help with mitigate procurement delays. I'm not sure I would link it to risk aversion.
How do we get more timely decisions?
I think it's about having consensus across the government on what the Canadian Armed Forces should look like and what it needs. That would be a place to start.
Thank you, Mr. Kelly. Mr. Souza.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for being here today and recognizing the complexity of these decisions, these procurement processes, the time that it takes just to qualify respective proponents, especially for the big ticket items. And I think you inferred that there is obviously a lot of requirement for more personnel. You certainly highlighted delays, and that's why we're having this discussion, because we're all concerned about the delays and the ability to be responsive to the needs as they come about. But just the fighter jets have taken so many years to come to fruition just by making a decision first, right? So, you talked about the delays being a big issue. You talk about personnel or being available or enabled or having the expertise within those decisions, and then you talked about inventory management and some of the delays in trying to maintain proper inventory. I presume you're able to audit this stuff effectively, notwithstanding some of these delays. You're obviously recognizing the problems. So what's the solutions? Do you have solutions for the issues that are before us? What do you suggest we do?
I wish I had a crystal ball and I could help with all of the procurement issues, but I would say that procurement...
I can't really hear.
I can't either. Can the Conservative side here cool it down? Okay. Please.
I would say that, you need personnel, you need capacity, right? So there's capacity on the procurement side that's needed. What we mentioned was not forgetting that it's not just about procurement capacity that you need. You need to also think about the personnel to use the items that you're buying, so pilots or captains, but then you also need maintenance and technicians. So that is part of what I would call planning for the life cycle of an audit of an item that you purchase. I do believe that having consensus on what the Canadian Armed Forces needs, and then staying on that, right? When you talk about the fighter jets, there were changes in what was needed, further commitments made. Originally, the commitment was about meeting a certain spend threshold. Then it was about meeting NATO and NORAD's highest alerts. So all of that adds to the capacity that's needed. I tend to wonder whether or not there is a sense of urgency in Canada to equip our military and our troops properly. And maybe that sense of urgency is something that needs to be brought into the mix.
And certainly the war that's happening in Ukraine is enabling us to be a bit more sensitive to our engagement. What about the shipbuilding strategy? Are we able to fulfill some of what's being proposed?
Well, the shipbuilding strategy is one of those areas that I think is contributing to some of the delays. I talked about trying to accomplish a lot in a procurement process where you have trade-offs. When you're trying to establish an industry to be able to build and repair ships in the country, that comes with a trade-off. So there's slowness, so speed is one of those trade-offs, potentially costs. So you have to balance that in a procurement process, and it comes to a policy decision on, is the procurement about getting ships, or is the procurement about getting ships and establishing an industry or a technological base in the country?
One of the recommendations made by a former witness was centralization, having a specialist procurement office to coordinate all these efforts under one roof. Do you think that's effective, given the complexity that's going to be made and the need for Treasury Board ultimately to make those decisions?
I think whether you have one person or many persons involved in the procurement process, if the decisions keep changing, then there will be delays. So it's about having consensus on what the Canadian Armed Forces needs.
Right. And the capacity, I think one of the questions was, do we have the capacity, the expertise within house to do this now?
Do we have the capacity to do military procurements now?
How much do we need to enhance? Like, obviously not, because you're suggesting that we're delayed.
I haven't done an assessment on how many procurement personnel would be needed in order to meet the demands, but I would argue that the current capacity in procurement across the federal public service is lacking, not even just in military. In other areas, if you look at IT procurements, there is a lack of capacity and expertise across the public service in general in procurement.
Yeah, but the expertise is there within the capacity that we have?
Well, I would like to think that our Canadian Armed Forces has the expertise that they need on what is needed, what the military will need to carry out its responsibilities effectively, and then it's about ensuring that you have the right procurement officers to support that. As I said, I did not do a detailed assessment to know whether or not we have all of those expertise. In each of our audits, we did highlight that the delays are mostly around decision-making and timeliness of decision-making that results in delays.
Thank you.
Thank you. Sousa, Madame Normandine. 6 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
6 minutes, please, Madam. Thank you very much. Thank you, Madam Auditor General, for being with us and for your opening statement. I would like to hear you further on the useful lives of equipment. You've mentioned that often equipment is used beyond the end of its useful life, and there's a cost for that. The life of the fleet, for example, has been extended. Is it seen across the board? Is this a systematic approach, extending the life of fleets and other equipment? Or perhaps are people too optimistic about the useful lives of the equipment? Should there be, a sort of a gap that people think in automatically to ensure that they don't go over the useful lives? Well, the useful life of an asset is a problem year in and year out. Not merely the vessels in a fleet or the airplanes. It can be, your computer. So, of course, analyses underestimate useful lives. However, there have been attempts to extend the useful lives, but that costs something. Once you extend the life of a vessel, for example, it costs more to keep it afloat. That's why I'm struggling a bit here. When you look at the legislation, it's clear that Arctic equipment, it's going to be beyond its useful life. So what are we doing for satellites? As soon as you buy an asset, you should be thinking through its useful life. 20 years, therefore 10 years in, we need to perhaps begin a new procurement process for replacing this piece of equipment. That's why I find it somewhat unusual that Canada isn't a little more proactive on this front. So perhaps be a little bit more conservative in our assessment of useful lives looking forward in order to, work to replace things a little early, perhaps, rather than systematically extending their lives. Yes, keeping in mind that technology changes. If Canada wishes to remain on the cutting edge, at least, sort of up there with everyone else, we do need to think through useful lives, the life cycles of equipment, and the contracts for replacing equipment to make sure we've got no gap. Thank you. You mentioned the matter of an insufficient number of technicians to ensure the upkeep, for example, of the Australian CFs. Should we purchase less equipment if we know we don't have the technicians to upkeep the equipment we have? Or should we be training more technicians? Where's the right balance when it comes to our ability to maintain what we've bought? I would perhaps go at it differently, saying if we had the staff, the personnel, the pilots, the technicians, perhaps there would be a higher sense of urgency as to replacing the equipment, that we need the equipment, given that we have the workers and the personnel to use it. And we might be more likely to respect our international obligations, for example. You can look at it both ways. Let me go back to what you mentioned about stock management, to the effect that units receive equipment late. You mentioned up to 60% of the equipment is received late. Do you have any suggestions to make to overcome this obstacle? Not large equipment purchases, but more or less everyday material. Is there anything we can do to ensure that equipment is delivered on time? This is something we brought up during our financial audits as well. This is a performance audit, but this is something we bring up every year when it comes to stocking the CAF. Many recommendations have been made. National Defence has a strategic plan over 10 years, so they are progressing year by year, but it takes time. As for the performance audit, I think the recommendation we made there was to ensure that all essential requests, be held to be essential, be treated as essential. Sometimes people say, well, it's essential just to make sure they get the equipment fast, rather than leaving it as an average sort of request. But that's a sort of problem that comes in defining whether it's essential or not. That speaks to planning. What do I need, where, and when? It's a matter of better management. The government isn't necessarily that good at managing stock ongoing in an efficient way, even though they do show they're able to respond to emergency situations very, very well. We've been in situations where we've seen the need to send equipment in quickly for emergencies, but it wasn't very efficient, you see. It had to be sent in an emergency basis. So the idea is to plan ahead. So ensuring that if you call something urgent, it's really is urgent. It's not just everything turning up to be urgent and then everything is in a bottleneck.
Ms. Matheson, 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Hogan, in the United States, there was a 6-month investigation done on military spending. It was by 60 Minutes, and then that prompted several senators to ask the Secretary of Defense to do an internal audit. So they found that the military procurement process is plagued with arbitrary price inflations from the industry itself. They cited two major factors for their investigation: the consolidation around a handful of industry players and the massive reduction in public servants dedicated to evaluating procurement projects. And at some points, they actually saw that some of these companies were boosting their total profits by about 40%, and sometimes as high as 4,000%. So there's a U.S. federal law that allows, or that says that it will not allow military equipment to be sold to international customers at any price less than the U.S. pays. So can you extrapolate, would that ensure that our Canadian system, as we look to purchase American equipment from those same producers, would then inflate the price of what Canadians are buying in the same way?
I'm not sure I know of the study at all. You're sharing it with me. I think if the statement is true that a foreign purchaser shouldn't pay less than what the American purchaser is paying, that yes, it would result in increased cost to Canada. But
so there's nothing in terms of what Canadian procurement process does that looks at what international costs are and how they're potentially gouged, and does that impact at all on how our own procurement process looks at things?
So Canadian procurement is usually really an open and transparent process, right? Meant to ensure that there are competing bids in order to reduce and avoid that kind of price, arbitrary price inflation, and that's typically why our procurement process requires an open and transparent bidding to be done. But did you want to add something, Andrew, on that front? Or?
I might just add that competition law would also enter into that aspect of ensuring that there isn't dumping or price inflation, conspiracy, that sort of thing. That is against the law. Now, it comes down to whether or not the procurements are also structured to make sure that we do get best value, and that price is a consideration that will drive the procurement decisions.
Okay. So 2 points in that. Actually, Mr. Sousa was sort of getting into that, and you said you weren't sure. There was an internal report by the Department of National Defence here in Canada that said that we were 30% short, or 4,200 positions of trained individuals on procurement, or procurement experts, I should say, and they've been struggling with that for years. So we lack the Department of National Defence within that expertise on procurement. We lack the expertise in terms of actual physical personnel to do that study to ensure that things like that don't happen. But there's also the issue there of, well, actually, if you could comment on that first, and then I'll get to the second part.
Well, I said I hadn't really done an assessment on military procurement capacity, but that I can say that there is a gap in procurement capacity across the federal public service in many areas. I raised IT. I know in many audits that we do, we always hear about the delays in procurement because there are no procurement officers. In fact, my own office struggles at times to have the right capacity and the right skill set in our procurement group. So it's definitely across the whole public service, and that likely contributes to your 30 to 40% determination that you mentioned.
Okay. So in terms of that that ballooning cost, right? It being industry driven, and the fact that we are shifting, there was an idea, of course, of that, what you talked about, that open contract, competition based sourcing. However, the government is moving to sole source procurement. Can you comment on how that will influence the costing as we move specifically to sole source?
I guess it depends on what else you're trying to accomplish with those sole source procurements, right? If we look at if there's competing demands, and as Andrew mentioned, if the dollar value and the value for money is part of the procurement decision. Sometimes it's about the timing. Other times it's about the other economic benefits. It might be about ensuring there's an industry created in Canada. So all of those are trade-offs to ensuring that impact the price, right? The delay. So it's about what you want to accomplish in a procurement other than just acquiring a good.
But if you see the issue, if, say, like the F-35s, for example, there was a sole source, they went to open competition, they eventually went to the Americans. The Americans are seeing now, through investigations, that they are being highly, highly gouged by certain companies. We buy at a certain competition rate. We do it in a sole source fashion now that we're moving forward in other purchases. We don't have enough people to look at that competition. Yes, competition law may say that that's not possible, but if we don't have all those pieces in place, is that not a problem in terms of driving up those costs?
Very briefly, please.
Delays in general drive up costs, right? So, I mean, that they just sort of go hand in hand, and not having the right personnel, not having a timely decision, not having a fast procurement will all be factors that contribute. I'm not sure I could point to just one thing to drive up a cost in a procurement.
Thank you, Ms. Madison. Mr. Bazan, 5 minutes, please.
Mr. Chair, and I want to thank the Auditor General, Ms. Hogan, and your office for being here again. Ms. Hogan, does the Department of National Defense give you access to all the information that you need to do your job when you're auditing anything? Like, you guys have all the security clearances needed. They don't withhold anything. So if you want to see contracts, you guys can see contracts?
Typically, we have absolutely no concerns whatsoever. Many of our personnel have the right security clearances that are needed, and if we didn't, we would ensure that we are able to get those. But we have not, at this point, with National Defense, had any concerns about access to information.
So when you do your study on national shipbuilding, and we're looking at the procurements in both AOPS, surface combatants, and joint supply ships out in C-SPAN, you're able to see those contracts to ensure that taxpayers are getting bang for their buck?
Absolutely. We've been able to see all the contracts that we wanted to see during our audits of national defense.
Okay. So when your office is drafting a report, and in every report, when we get it back, it already has response from the government that they agree with the recommendations you're making. Is there a back and forth between the government and your office when the report's being drafted as to the wordsmithing or even changing the recommendations that you are making to national defense?
So at the end of every audit, we always ensure that we verify our facts with the department. So we always clear factual accuracy, ensure that we've received all the information, and then we do then talk about the recommendation. There is a bit of a back and forth about the recommendation, absolutely. It is to ensure that the recommendation is something that the department will implement, but that will meet the goals of addressing the gaps and the issues that we identified. There's no point in us putting forward a recommendation that no one will implement or just say they will and then not do anything about it. But I would not say that it's about negotiating or wordsmithing that recommendation. It's about making sure that it's an achievable recommendation that addresses the weaknesses that we found.
So your predecessor in 2018 on the fighter jet replacement, when we're looking at the F-18s and buying the used Australian jets, in a draft report that was leaked out, it said, in our opinion, the government does not need to spend $470 million to buy used F-18 fighter jets that are as old and have the same combat capability efficiency as Canada's current fleet. You went on then into the recommendation saying national defense should not purchase interim aircraft until it implements plans to recruit and train pilots and technicians. That was in the draft report. The final report actually says the national defense should develop and implement recruitment and retention strategies for fighter force technicians and pilots that are designed to meet operational requirements and prepare for the transition to the replacement fleet. So definitely a change in tone. Definitely not don't bother wasting money, taxpayer money, on the Aussie fighter jets. So are we seeing this happen more often, or is that just a one-off?
Well, I can speak a little bit to that situation. In my mind, that was really touching the policy line, the policy decision on whether or not the planes should have been purchased. I guess in my view, the government had made a commitment to meet the NORAD and NATO highest level of alert. You needed planes in order to be able to do that. So that's a policy decision to meet it. I have not, in my time as AG, seen us change unless we were missing facts, missing information, or that our recommendation was really one that the department would not implement. Our goal is to improve the public service and not to spend time to not result in a change occurring.
So on that comment of improving public service, and with our study that we're doing here at National Defense, looking at improvements in procurement of national defense and getting the material and equipment that we need in a more timely and costly manner, what are your recommendations to this committee then on how do we speed up the process of buying equipment? How do we make sure that and you already kind of touched on it, that there isn't enough people that specialize in buying defense or buying defense equipment? Where's the sweet spot that we can do our fiduciary duty of respecting taxpayer money and get the equipment that our armed forces need in a dangerous world we live in?
I think it starts, and I've said it before, but I'll put it to 2 points. It starts with having a consensus on what the Canadian Armed Forces needs and what it should look like. And then it's about going ahead with the procurements to meet that end state, but thinking about the whole life cycle planning of your procurement. So it isn't just about getting the good. It's about having all the people that you need. And it's
life cycle costs. Our enemy cares about what assets we bring to deal with the threat environment. So
I hear you, but the public service should care about life cycle costs.
Right, but then how do we do it in an expedited manner to deal with the challenges that we have?
Well, what I care about is the time. Is Mr. Bazan's time has expired. Yes. So maybe you can circle back in on Mr. Bazan's question at some point in the future. Mr. Fisher, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you very much, Ms. Hogan, to you and your team for being here. It's been a really interesting conversation, and we've talked about a lot of the similar things here, but I want to go to the national shipbuilding strategy, and you talked about trade-offs, the balance between, perhaps quick procurement versus building an industry like we're doing in Canada, where traditionally we were boom and bust. We would build a couple of ships, we would send those folks off with skill sets that hopefully they would find other work, and then maybe 30 years later when we needed new ships, we would try to do the same thing. What we're seeing now in Nova Scotia, specifically in Halifax, and they cut steel in Dartmouth Coal Harbour as well, but what we're seeing is each ship that they build, and you talked about 50 ships over 30 years across the country, but specifically in the Atlantic region, each ship is, I would say, more efficiently built than the previous one, although I think the efficiency levels are getting a little bit smaller incrementally as we build more and more ships. But what we're seeing now is we're building a industry of expertise and capacity in shipbuilding. And I can say for one, for a fact from what I've seen is this is really, really valuable. The spin-off jobs, the expertise that's being built in some of the best shipbuilders in the world now in Canada is it seems to be the way to go, and your job, of course, is finding value for money. Do you find value in that building of a domestic capacity where the value might not be seen on day one, but might be seen closer to the middle or the end of the contract?
I mean, the shipbuilding strategy really had 3 objectives, right? The renewing the fleet, creating a marine sector, and then generating economic benefits for Canada. And you're right, many of those are really long-term objectives. And so today, it's hard to tell you that there is value in that investment. But that's the policy choice that the country has made to go forward. And now it's about tracking and not forgetting about those. But those come, as I said, with trade-offs, right? Creating a marine sector comes with some delays as they get ready to reach that target state that was intended by the shipbuilding strategy. Where things could have been sped up is the length of time to negotiate those contracts to figure out who pays for what. Is it the private sector? Is it the government? How do you get to that place? It was about 7 years from the first umbrella agreement with a shipyard to the first ship. That's a very long time to just negotiate what needs to happen. It delays then the builds of all future ships. So, value for money can be weighed in many ways. While there might be economic benefits, the delays and the costs of extending service life might offset those. So, again, it comes down to more timely decision-making on what the Canadian Armed Forces needs.
you think that historical boom and bust is some of the reason for, if we move away from the national shipbuilding strategy, that type of thing, is that a cause for, do you think, for past delays in procurement for military products?
If we move off of,
No, the historical boom and bust.
okay.
Is that something that has caused those delays and that?
I don't know about that. I think not everything that the military needs can be built in Canada. So it's about figuring out exactly from a strategic point of view what should be built in Canada and what should be procured outside of Canada might help. So if the decision is that ships should be built here, then where's the other trade-off? What other things maybe shouldn't be built here? Is a strategy choice to make.
Mr. D'Souza touched on unfilled positions. You said that, and I just want to get a little bit of clarity here. You said that we have the experts in procurement, we have the skill sets, but we have a gap in capacity. So is that strictly a person power thing, a manpower thing? Is that because I understand that we're in competition with the private sector for some of these skill sets and some of these experts as well?
I mean, I would argue that Public Service and Procurement Canada does have a ton of expertise in procurement. And when I say the Canadian government has procurement expertise, it does. Does it have the capacity to handle the volume of procurement? I don't believe so. We see it in many areas across the public service. And I mentioned not only military, but in IT procurement. There's just... and especially on that front, there is competition with the private sector, and there's just a shortage of expertise in that area.
Mr. Fisher, Madame Normandine, 2.5 minutes.
2.5 minutes, please. Thank you so much. I would like to go back to something you said about the need for political consensus on the future of the armed forces. I'd like to hear more about that. Taking, for example, what's going on in other countries, things I've heard tell of, for example, that there is a renewal of policies every 2 years carried out by the civil service to ensure that there's continuity in matters of procurement rather than having sort of politically motivated changes coming in at every time there's a new election. What should we look for when it comes to a consensus, and how long should policies last for? Say more about this. We can see it here with the procurement of the airplanes. There are changes in decisions as to which direction to head in, how many fighters do we need, and so on and so forth. So that's what I mean by arriving at a consensus about what the Canadian Armed Forces need and what they should look like. There seems to be a lack of, an overall sense of urgency, the urgency of equipping our armed forces. If we look at what has been said in audits on other material, I wonder why we mightn't be more proactive. In the Arctic, the waters are becoming navigable. The ice is melting. There are gaps just on the horizon. Satellites, for example. We lack ships. We lack satellites. So what will it take to accelerate the purchasing, the procurement process? I think it's a matter of feeling that urgency and then coming to consensus. To redress matters, wouldn't it be interesting to have the civil servants carry out the analysis first rather than waiting for, policies and politicians to make requests first? Perhaps we might begin with better ongoing assessment by civil servants. Yes, well, that is indeed what the civil service should be doing, thinking of the future, the coming generations, because political cycles can be very short. 4 years, that's not very long, and sometimes it's even less than 4 years. That's why good partnership between civil servants and politicians is of the highest importance in order to really get your mind around the needs.
2.5 minutes, Ms. Matheson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Interestingly, that was going to be some of my questioning, and just in terms of, do you think that the urgency of climate change, of those needs, are adequately presented within the National Defence's priorities in terms of how we procure and respond to what's needed?
I think what we found in our audit on Arctic waters is there was an assessment, gaps identified, and then there was a few years and there was a reassessment, same gaps confirmed, and then it was done again. So it's the need now to make a decision to deal with that. You know, as I mentioned earlier on, the gaps that the country's going to see in its ability to surveil the north, or for ships, the icebreakers or other ships, didn't sneak up on the country. It has been known, and so it's, you know, where is that sense of urgency to make that decision? Is it linked to targets moving? Is it linked to procurement capacity? There's likely many things that contribute to it, but it needs to start, I think, with knowing the end state, and then that requires consensus, and then moving forward. I could talk longer if you'd like.
Nope. In your 2020 report, one of the recommendations, I think you mentioned it somewhat here already, but it was to the National Defence should review its materials, forecasting, positioning to ensure sufficient stocks are maintained at the right locations. And I've spoken to folks within the union of UNDE employees. One of their major concerns, of course, is that privatization and the privatization of those positions out of bases and so on. Could you comment on that?
So it's my understanding that the concerns that the union raised are linked more to services being provided on bases, so cleaning services and things like that, not necessarily the procurement of goods.
Those are the people that maintain, you know, they make sure that people have the kit that they need, and they reorder them as needed and so on, right? Mm-hmm. As I understand it.
Yeah, I think our audit really focused on the goods that the military needs and how that stock is managed. So the country is very vast, and there's a military presence across the country, making sure that you have the right materials where you need them, less about servicing the buildings or the bases that was outside.
Know what stocks you need if you don't have the people to take an inventory of those stocks and adequately track them?
A lot of them, on the bases, a lot of the stock is managed by military, and the main depots are really managed by some military personnel, while there might be a combination of non-military and military there. My experience as I visited some of them is that there are mostly military folk in those.
Thank you, Ms. Manson. Ms. Kramp-Nyman, 5 minutes.
Perfect. He did say it right.
I'm impressed myself.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for being here today. My first question, just to clarify something that you stated earlier, with regards to the report itself, if the government says no, we're not going to proceed with that, then, and if it's not even in the report, if the Auditor General thinks it's important, well, how can they not proceed with it? What's the purpose of doing the report if there's not going to be any movement on it?
So if we had a recommendation that the government's like, we're just not going to do that, and we felt it was really essential, we'd leave it in there and tell them to disagree with us, and we'd have that conversation in an open and transparent way. When I talked about making sure it was something they would implement, those are minor adjustments. It's about, I think you should do it this way. Well, could we do it that way? Absolutely, you could do it that way. So it's those kinds of adjustments. It's not about, this isn't a recommendation that you shouldn't get, right? That's why it's key that it has to address the recommendations that we raised. Did you want to? You're looking at me, so you want to jump in.
I'll give you an example. So we had a disagreement on a recommendation in relation to the COVID benefits and the recovery from the Canada Revenue Agency. We made that recommendation going in, knowing full well that we'd have a disagreement on that. In other cases, maybe we were coming close to the policy line and we can achieve the recommendation's spirit in a different way. Another example of that, temporary foreign workers, we wanted to make a recommendation about the quality of the living quarters. And we did, but we didn't want to trample on provincial jurisdiction. So we had to adjust our recommendation. In the example that was given earlier in our fighter jets, that's an example of where we're coming close to the policy line. I think looking at this recommendation at this point in time, and our audit objective at the time, which was about supporting the ability to meet NORAD and NATO at the same time, we focused the recommendation on the personnel.
Let's talk the government's alignment of defense procurement with retention and recruitment. Simply put, what I'm trying to ask is, are there adequate measures in place to ensure that we have the personnel to maintain and operate the equipment we purchase from the time when it's delivered? And to complement that question as well, can you provide numbers of how many pilots we currently have and technicians?
If Nick maybe wants to add in there, but following our audit in our follow-up on past audits, which is a tool that we only have online that you can look at, we wanted to go and see how they were doing on ensuring there were sufficient pilots. They've made some progress there on the pilot front, on the procurement front, but really hadn't made much progress on the maintenance and technical crew. And they had a process still ongoing, but that's why we couldn't comment on it. I don't know if you know, Nick, pilots now, if you have any numbers that you can share.
Circle back to the committee with numbers if you do have any, that'd be helpful. Okay.
Like, it might be best to ask National Defense, and unless we've audited the pilots themselves, we wouldn't have that information. We'd have to go to National Defense to ask for it.
Also, earlier you mentioned the importance of creating industries and recognizing how this can absolutely work. We've seen examples in Canada when it works and when it doesn't. Do you feel there's a danger to the industry and CAF operational capabilities if we try and create an industry where none exists just because we want and or need the jobs in Canada, but then the industry fails?
I guess that's where the comment I made earlier about it's a strategic decision on what should be built in Canada and can be built in Canada and why, and that really is a policy choice. I don't believe that Canada can build everything that it would need. While a large country, we are a small country, and so it's about where can Canada excel. That's a decision that should be made, so that the focus on industrial benefits really has the most enduring quality for Canada. Right?
Okay, my last question. You spoke earlier about delays in procurement, that they may occur because the government's needing to balance CAF needs with economic benefits. Do we need to do a better job in balancing the immediate needs of the CAF and the potential long-term benefits from ITBs?
I think quickly I would answer yes. Again, it goes back to that comment on the consensus on what should the Canadian Armed Forces look like now and what does it need, and then when does it need to be there? Where is that sense of urgency? When should that sense of urgency kick in?
Thank you, Ms. Crampton. I'm in Madame O'Connell, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you all for being here today. The way I'm envisioning based on what you've described in terms of the procurement process, is that it sounds like, the expertise are certainly there, but we've said time and time again that it's the capacity issue. It almost sounds like when there's a big contract coming, everybody works together to deal with whatever that need is, kind of move forward once that's completed, and then everyone goes back to move on to the next big thing. And I'm just wondering if perhaps, especially for CAF, since the equipment requires, like if we're using the example of shipbuilding or purchasing aircraft, it requires that constant long-term planning. Is part of it perhaps not a dedicated kind of team, or looking at, or it's, instead of a dedicated team, it's more of a need-by-need basis, kind of flurry in government, working on something and then moving on to the next big thing. Would that be a fair assessment, or what is it that doesn't allow for that constant long-term planning and reassessment?
Well, I guess I would tell you that I believe it's about having that life cycle planning thought out first, and not just reacting. Oh, we're going to have a gap we're going to run out of certain types of ships. They're no longer in service. Maybe we should think about replacing them. It is about having that long-term thinking. I would argue that there are so many pieces of equipment in the Canadian Armed Forces that, yes, you would probably have a dedicated team in the long term doing that if you really were planning on full life cycle for major equipment in the armed forces.
But it doesn't sound like that. There may be a CAF dedicated team, but in terms of that focus of even if you get that next contract out tomorrow, the day after that, you begin the process of the next, 15, 20 years, et cetera. And so, but governments often don't work that way. It's that immediate, check, move on to the next big thing. So I guess it's how do we create that within the public service, number one. And number two, that balance of democracy, and different parties are going to be elected on different platforms based on what Canadians send them here. So there's not always going to be that consistency in policy. And so how do we balance the public service work, but allowing that public discourse or change of priorities to still exist? So it's that balance I'm kind of struggling to figure out.
I guess I would point to one of the findings in our surveillance of Arctic waters. And actually, so all of the reports that we're talking about today, there are longstanding known issues, longstanding known gaps. A ship doesn't have an unlimited life. Regardless of what the main political or policy decision might be, there are a certain level of ships that Canada will just need, especially to monitor the Arctic. That base should fundamentally be there, and there is no acting on those longstanding known gaps until they are creating a potential gap in surveillance, which is what we're seeing now if something isn't done, right? So again, I think it's about while consensus might take some time, there should be a base level of what is needed, and that should be maintained. The commitment made to meet NORAD and NATO's high alert is one that was made many, many years ago. That requires a large amount of aircraft. That commitment is still there. So then you need to have the public service work towards continuously being able to meeting that commitment, including the spending commitment that's been made.
Well, that's part of, I guess, the question throughout this study I hope we hone in on a little bit better is that every government wants to make the announcement in those commitments, but they don't want the line item in their budgets. And that is how we have to figure out how to make sure that that continuous funding is part of the ongoing discourse so that that's not the question, because that's the fight every time. It's the cost and going to the public. So, but how do we make sure that that public service and that procurement work is ongoing behind the scenes so that at least governments have choices, but that we're not in a situation where, it's not ready even if you wanted to make that investment.
Ms. O'Connell is extremely clever. She asked her question right at the end of her 5 minutes and leaves you. But because of your efficiency, we're going to ask you to answer Ms. O'Connell's question, then wrap it up. Thank you.
Thank you. I guess I would point to there needs to be a consensus on what the Canadian Armed Forces should look like and needs. And that shouldn't fundamentally change. We are one country. We need to do what's right to support our troops, and that consensus is needed to ensure that there are no longer gaps for what the military needs.
Thank you, Madam Auditor General, and your colleagues. As I sat here, I can't help thinking that that in the course of this committee being impaneled and doing what we do, the threat environment has changed dramatically, and it doesn't seem to have penetrated the government writ large, whether it's civil servants or whether it's the politicians. And we don't have the luxury of time, even if we ever did have the luxury of time. We no longer have the luxury of time. And so this study does have maybe an urgency that it even a year ago or even 2 years ago it wouldn't have had. So I thank you for your contribution. I wish you'd come with a silver bullet, but apparently you don't. So,
well, if I may, Mr. Chair,
yes.
I guess I would leave you with the question of to motivate that consensus is needed. It is too late once the ships are in our Arctic to say, oh, there's a ship in our Arctic. What should we do about it? And so it's that need to recognize what our Canadian Armed Forces needs to protect us domestically, but also to meet our international commitments.
Yeah. Indeed. Thank you for that. And with that, we will suspend, empanel, or re-empanel, and move on. No stranger to the committee, Professor Lagacé from Carleton University and Professor Anissa Kimball from the University de Laval. Both of you are experienced before this committee, so I'll ask Professor Lagacé to start for a 5-minute opening statement and then move to Professor Kimball.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I also thank the members of the committee. My opening comments today are based on 20 years of academic study of Canadian defence, as well as a decade of experience as an independent reviewer of the defence procurement process. First, as a member of the independent review panel overseeing the evaluation of options to replace the CF-18s from 2012 to 2014, then as a member of the independent review panel for defence acquisition from 2015 to 2022.
As a member of the RPDA, I had the opportunity to review and advise 3 separate ministers on over 100 major Crown projects planned for D&D CAF and the Canadian Coast Guard as they made their way through options analysis. I have 5 interrelated observations to convey on defence procurement based on this experience. First, there is a mismatch between our defence policy and defence funding. Les ambitions du Canada en
Canada's defence policy ambitions are significant. Our stated defence policy objectives over the past 20 years would require a level of defence spending over and above 2% of our GDP. Unfortunately, our spending tends to hover closer to 1.5% of GDP. This leads to a structural deficit in our capability development.
D&D CAF have contributed to this problem. Governments, be they Liberal or Conservative, want Canada to play an important part on the world stage, hence their embrace of ambitious policies, yet they have not been willing to spend on par with their ambitions. D&D CAF, in turn, need policy direction from the government to acquire the capabilities that are required to face the threats that we face. This leads D&D CAF to advocate for ambitious policies and worry about adequate funding later. Secondly, our costing of defence procurement is undermined by a pervasive optimism bias. Capital projects are costed too early in the procurement process before any serious work has been done on requirements. When requirements are developed and engagement with industry occurs, too many projects discover that they lack sufficient funding, which either leads to delays or compromises on quality or quantity of the capabilities that are ultimately acquired. Le ministère a besoin d'une
D&D requires a more robust costing method, one that eschews optimism in favor of pessimism. The government, moreover, must come to accept that the costs of certain capabilities cannot be known early on and can only be realistically set after options analysis has been completed. Third, Canadian defence procurement is overly rigid and it's risk-aversive to keep pace with technological change. Our procurement system is designed to minimize risk and ensure that robust safeguards and checks are enforced. Unfortunately, this means that the system cannot easily adapt to rapidly changing technologies and evolving operational needs.
CAF has the latest and most relevant technologies in key areas. D&D must be allowed to take greater risks and move more quickly. I note, however, this will lead to failures, errors, and regrettable uses of public funds in isolated cases. But these are the trade-offs that we must accept if we want CAF to be equipped with the right technologies at the right time in most cases. As importantly, as parliamentarians, you will need to arrive at a common agreement that not every failure or error should be seized upon for partisan advantage. Without a bipartisan consensus on this issue, the procurement process will not be able to speed up or meet the ever-adapting threat. Quatrièmement,
Fourth, D&D and CAF are facing significant capacity challenges. You've already discussed this with the Auditor General, so I won't get into the details.
That increasing D&D CAF's capacity to manage procurement the human side of the equation cannot be ignored and must be better appreciated. We are asking too much of too few people, and this is not a recipe for success. Finally, Canada must continue to make transparency in procurement a priority. D&D has made important advances in making defense procurement more transparent. Of note, the Defense Capabilities Blueprint now provides easily accessible information about where projects find themselves in the procurement system and what capabilities they are delivering. Toutefois, le Canada est encore...
However, Canada still lags behind its allies, such as Australia and the United Kingdom, in providing detailed information about the overall capital portfolio, its affordability, and the risks that surround it, and individual projects. Canada should publish an annual report akin to the Australian Major Projects Report and the British Defence Equipment Plan to ensure Parliament and the public have a better understanding of the overall capital program and the progress that is being made.
Hey, Professor Kimball, 5 minutes.
I appreciate your invitation to speak before the Standing Committee today. I invite you to join me in acknowledging that the land from which I offered these remarks is the traditional territory, unceded territory of the Abenaki, Wabanaki Confederacy, and Owastegwe. As a scholar of international cooperation, these comments draw from ideas in the organizational management literature of public administration and political science, the economics research on collective behavior, and political science work on institutions as political actors, as well as the institutional design of legal contracts, including my own work from 2015 on modifications to the U.S. defense procurement system undertaken throughout the Obama administrations with respect to contract design. In that work, I offered a set of recommendations to Canada for defense procurement. In fact, I was pleased to see that one of the recommendations from said research was partially adopted when the government accepted my recommendation that Canada work to diversify the sources of its contract partners concerning major defense procurement projects when it purchased the F-18 Hornets from Australia. That recommendation was offered during presentation on an expert panel in 2014. It then appeared in 2015 in a policy paper, and finally in a cost-benefit analysis I provided to MLI on the interim purchase itself. It was the final recommendation. So I appreciate that it took 3 distinct occasions over a number of years to make that recommendation see the light of day. And right now, of course, we have purchased those items, but it's still a few years until full delivery and full integration into the force, which is expected for 2025. And so I think it's important to note that, that took a decade, and I think we can improve there. So I'm going to offer 5 recommendations in the next portion of these remarks. By way of introduction, the bureaucratic steps and processes required to procure equipment and assets to equip CAF and functionally defend Canada's territory could be described as an interlayered labyrinth of procedures and processes managed and implemented by various stakeholders across different agencies. These processes and procedures are sets of institutions and practices with the goal of ensuring transparency in the responsible use of funds and resources on the behalf of the public through accountability to the electorate. Institutions can also be interpreted as constraints to restrain actors, as well as obstacles to efficiency, obstacles to speed. They may be unfavorable to the flexibility required by governments during crisis, which is needed and to ensure CAF readiness. So there is a trade-off between ensuring oversight versus speed in the face of a punctual crisis that may require defense force responses. And we saw this emergency procurement in some senses during the pandemic. And so on procurement affecting CAF readiness, so Canada has done a level of constraining itself, one might say, through the creation of institutions producing various trade-offs, delays, and externalities. As an example, policies concerning defense industrial offsets complicate the production of defense goods it needs. This is, market intervention meant to redistribute benefits. Other schemes are available to do this that are frankly more efficient. Canada's wasting time, wasting resources, and affecting readiness when it does that. Its procurement process could be improved through modifying and even abandoning those industrial regional benefits, which I know would be very critical and not very popular. It is a distortion on the market, and frankly, it impacts the procurement process. There are effects, and essentially it delays essential military and defense R&D products and projects. And so this speaks directly to readiness of forces. When it comes to procurement, from research and development, particularly. A second example is Canada's DND Innovation Funding Authority. In fact, one of the problems is that it has severe limitations in terms of what we call other transfer authority. An OTA is essentially how we go about hiring these defense sector contractors and companies to produce the projects. And so in the United States in 2016, there were various changes to what in an amendment called OTA 815, an authorization amendment. And these modifications made the process in the United States much more nimble, flexible, and capable to manage with delays. And so I'm going to talk about a couple of these things which Canada could adopt itself without very much work. And so basically three parts, these 815 amendments affected three parts of the legislation. First, the dollar thresholds at which additional approvals are required for OTA. What it means to be a non-traditional defense contractor. They loosened what it means to be a non-professional and how companies can kind of become available again to become the non-traditional contractors. And certain aspects about transitioning from prototype development into production. And I see this as very important for Canada because this is where right now we have huge delays in what's going on. There are extra processes involved, and there are ways in which we can make procurement more nimble by doing various things. And so right now, for example, in the United States, these changes mean that once a project has been approved for a certain level of amount, they can up those levels of approval into certain limits as long as the initial contracting procedure was competitive. And so those projects themselves...
Professor Kimball, we're past the 5-minute point, quite a bit past the 5-minute point.
Sorry.
Can we...
Yep. I'm going to come right down to the point.
Okay. 2 seconds on your final point.
Okay, 2 seconds. First thing, the contracts themselves, there needs to be a much greater follow-up in terms of how we restrain the two parties and ensure that there is actually good faith in terms of overriding the limits, the financial limits of the contracts that could be done better, shared better. And finally, one of the most important things is essentially in the ex ante, the early parts of the contract, there needs to be much more development, much more focus in terms of the timeline for the project, because that is where those overages will occur due to uncertainties about technological development. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Kimball. Ms. Gallant, 6 minutes.
Kimball, the Prime Minister has told NATO that he's no intention of having Canada allocate 2% of GDP on defense because it simply doesn't translate into votes. Has the sentiment of Canadians changed since Putin began his attack on Ukraine?
I think that question was directed to you, Professor Kimball.
Okay, I was just making sure. Well, I think it's very clear that 2% was an important guideline and focal target when we were talking about enlarging the alliance. And so 2% has its use, but 2% in terms of thinking about how Canada allocates and what Canada gets out of that allocation is simply not very pragmatic. And so, yes, I think it's important that this is a guideline, but in terms of what Canada can kind of contribute, it does a lot without me reaching 2%. And frankly, at 1.4, the other essential thing is that this is a value that is linked to the economic size. And so when you look around, Canada has a large economy. And so for it to move that 2% in any way requires much more spending.
Well, we have larger economies who far exceed the 2%. So what action has the government taken, Dr. Kimball, to avoid having to wait in line as a consequence of NATO members' critical defense needs in Eastern Europe?
In terms of waiting in line, I'm unsure if you mean waiting in line to get procurement, to reprocure the types of assets that it has sent to Ukraine?
To procure the assets that not all, but several of the other NATO countries are trying to procure at the same time for the use in Ukraine.
Canada has tied its own hands with its procurement system in the sense that there are a lot of stakeholders that make the process very slow. If you look at, for example, the Polish procurement system and improvements in the American procurement system, it makes it so that once you've had competitive processes in the beginning, you can kind of keep things rolling and the finances coming in as long as the project is making progress. And so right now, essentially, there's a lot of returns in the process, which bring in those delays. Now, when it comes to the equipment itself, I think it's very clear Canada has to recognize it simply doesn't have those security threats that are as acute as some of those other European partners. And the United States and other countries are going to send those military resources to those countries first.
Thank you. Dr. Legacy, 3D printing seem to be the future and transformational with respect to supply and procurement. Do you see Canada taking this view and implementing any aspects of this?
At this stage, I would consider that that's still experimental from a defense procurement point of view. It may be introduced when it comes to certain types of spare parts or other things of that nature. But really, at the end of the day, that's for industry to demonstrate that it can supply things more quickly and still meet the requirement.
Okay. Dr. Legacy, could we make the process faster and more efficient by reducing the number of departments and agencies involved in procurement?
I don't believe that that's the key component. And if we were to move to a single agency now while we're trying to recapitalize the force, that would likely be disastrous, to be quite frank.
Okay, Dr. Legacy, would getting D&D and CAF to reduce the number of specifications or modifications they're seeking in procurements be an effective means of speeding up delivery?
Yes, if we were to try to reduce the amount of Canadianization that we do to equipment, that would speed things up. I will note, however, that one of the reasons that we Canadianize is that we buy so rarely that we try and put everything that we can within a platform. And so we put that onus on ourselves. But if we were to say, as a matter of course, we will buy more often, but we will buy simpler, there again, and this is what I was hinting at with having to take risks.
With respect to industrial and technological benefits policy, are the primary costs and benefits worth the effort?
I think, as the Auditor General pointed, this ultimately comes down to trade-offs in society. Do you want to use defense dollars squarely to equip your military, or do you see it as a jobs program as well? I think it's fair to say we tend to see it as both.
Has the government paid sufficient attention to the world view about the most appropriate military force structure since it came into power in 2015?
I did a significant review as part of the 2017 defense policy, and the department and the CAF offer the government various views. As a number of people have written, this is really building on the CFDS policy of 2008. On the fundamentals, we're generally in agreement. The question becomes, are we funding adequately for that? And that's where I would have concerns.
Okay, so does it explain some of Canada's current procurement troubles?
Absolutely. If you try to have a defense policy that creates a force that requires 2% of GDP to fund adequately, and you only have 1.5% of GDP, you're going to run into structural deficits around the creation of that capability.
Does Canada's military have the capabilities to respond to a conflict abroad at any given moment?
It depends in what manner we can respond, but it would really be more of putting a flag as part of a coalition in some cases. In other cases, we might be able to commit more, but it really depends on the nature of the conflict and the crisis.
Cheryl? Sorry. That's it. Trying to get your attention. Sorry. Madame Lambropoulos, 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair, and I'd like to begin by thanking our witnesses for being here to answer some of our questions. I'm going to start with Monsieur Lagacé. You spoke a little bit to Canada's ability to procure domestically some things better than others, and that the industry, some industries are stronger than others within the country, and that we would be better off from a defense perspective procuring certain things outside. But it's been brought to our attention, or at least to mine, that we don't necessarily, even in things that we are strong in and that our industries are world-renowned in, we don't necessarily give top priority to our own companies. And so I'm wondering if you think that there's any way to increase domestic capacity, at least by focusing on the ones that we do have strengths in, and figuring out a way to prioritize our own when we are able to. If you could speak to that in any way, go into a little bit more depth.
As we saw with the shipbuilding strategy, you can make it policy that you're going to build something within Canada. But if you try and acquire other capabilities writ large, one of the challenges you're going to face is that you have to convince industry to invest in something that you're going to buy a very limited amount of, and that they then need to sell internationally. And as we've seen when it comes to foreign military sales to various regimes, we then get concerned about where we end up selling these things. So you have to convince industry that you're actually going to buy on scale for them to make the investment worthwhile, which, given the size of our military, we simply can't do. So it's good to buy Canadian when you can, but Canada can't produce everything. It has to produce something that can compete on a global scale.
How much of a role do you think the Canadian government can play in promoting some of the things that Canada produces abroad in terms of defense, and including with our NATO partners or any of our allies? In what way? I know that they need that interoperability. So in what way can the Canadian government play a role in ensuring that some of our own products are being pushed or at least promoted out there, so that other countries can, or so that we can use our own stuff and that we can, be the leaders in that one way?
We already do that with the Canadian Commercial Corporation. So CCC does have a program of promoting Canadian defense industries and defense goods. And here again, though, it is a question of how much you want to invest in particular capabilities. I'll give an example, which is maybe not well known, but for instance, the upgrading of our Halifax-class frigates was a successful upgrade that was then subsequently pursued by the New Zealanders thereafter. So we're actually quite good at this. It's just a question of recognizing that we can't do it across the panoply of defense capability. We're very good in certain areas, and CCC and the Government of Canada do promote those industries.
Okay. I like what you're saying. However, having spoken to some of these industries, it seems that there's a lack of communication between what the needs are and what they could potentially produce. And so I think that maybe, filling in that gap would potentially be able to help both get what they need. I was wondering if you can tell us about the procurement processes in other countries, what other countries are doing this better, especially getting and really pushing their own and getting their own domestic capacity up.
You really want to see an example of what a truly nationalized defense procurement system is. You look at a country like France. So, for instance, France will invest heavily in maintaining its own domestic defense industry at great costs, I would add, and sometimes it leads to some illogical practices. So, for instance, there are some years where Dassault will only produce a couple of Rafale aircraft just to keep the production line going, but they keep it going. Now, we have to ask yourself, as a Canadian, and we had the Auditor General here, would we accept subsidizing a defense industry producing one or two pieces of equipment just to keep the line going because we think it's important nationally to maintain that industry? That's always an option, but to be quite frank, we're too capitalistic for that.
Would you say that maybe France is in a different situation than Canada would be in terms of its geopolitical location? And do you think maybe Canada doesn't necessarily need to go that far in that respect?
Well, it really comes to, as we're seeing with the ships, the shipbuilding strategy. You can make it a policy that you will fund the development of Canadian industry and that you will buy a certain amount from Canada. That comes with cost increases. It comes with political pressure to keep those lines going. It comes with, in some cases, higher cost, reduction of capability. But ultimately, you build the ships in Canada, you get the expertise, and you know that you can rely on that yard. So all this comes down to trade-offs. Are we willing to do that beyond ships? And that is ultimately the question that we have to answer.
Thank you.
Yep.
I'm sorry?
30 seconds. Now you have 20 seconds.
Okay. Well, I'll just cede my time then, and I thank you for answering the questions.
Thank you, Ms. Lambravolis. Madame Normandine, 6 minutes, s'il vous plaît. 6
minutes, please. Thank you very much. I will begin with questions to Mr. Lagacé. You have spoken of a mismatch between policies and funding that is assigned to meet CAF needs. and DND needs. But we heard the Parliamentary Budget Officer last week tell us that all the funds budgeted for them isn't necessarily expended. There's lapsed funding of about $4 billion for 2023-2024. So how does that work? You're saying there's not enough money in the pipeline, and yet we see that there's a good deal of money not being spent. What's the problem there? A difference between the level of spending necessary to upkeep and ensure long-term capacity, and also there's the ability to spend. The fact that you're not able to spend the money means that you haven't spent enough priorly to have the personnel in the institutions up and running in order to spend the money. You have to build capacity within DND. The cuts in the 70s that cut by 30% defense personnel, you wound up with a DND that's now unable to spend, so to speak. So you've got a defense policy asking for a great deal of capacity, but you haven't got the institutional capacity to spend the money to actually get to that end. So what you see now is the effects of past cuts. So the fact that there is this unspent money piling up from year to year shows that the structural problem is worsening. If we're unable to invest in personnel, able to spend the money, costs will skyrocket long term. Every year that you don't spend, each delay in the acquisition of new equipment, well, eventually, when you do manage to buy it, it's going to cost more to procure it. Thank you. For the bias to optimism, you said that we need a better costing process, but I'd like to know about the cause. What's the reason for the bad diagnoses? Of course, you need a good diagnosis to get the right remedy, but why do we have this bias? Well, we like to have very ambitious policies in matters of defense, but we don't necessarily want to say, here's the money to do what you need to do to get there. So everyone should get together to ensure that we get over this hump here. Everybody wants low cost, yes, but you want a high level of result. You need to face up to the long-term cost. Anyone has an incentive to remain optimistic in this scenario, but it doesn't necessarily work out for the best. Another thing you mentioned, and this reminds me of something that Professor Kimball mentioned. You mentioned that the Great Britain and Australia have transparent public procurement processes with their annual reports and so on. But Professor Kimball was mentioning that surveillance sometimes hampers speed. So you're saying that we need to be transparent, have these reports, but could that slow down the speed of procurement? I'd like to hear Professor Kimball on this as well. Perhaps you could sort of speak to each other's points of view on this. Well, we're already doing this. The studies are already carried out, inside the department. They've got the analysis. It's just a matter of providing it to Canadians and involving the Auditor General to ensure that things are on track. They're already doing it. But about the risk that it would slow down the actual procurement process itself. Is there a risk? The fact that there's greater surveillance of the process. Well, there's already sort of oversight, if you wish, rather than surveillance of the process. The idea is making it transparent. But then if you, let's say, decide that you're going to turn this into a scandal, a political crisis, that will slow everything down. I understand the interest in transparency, but the idea is to ensure that there's greater confidence in the system, and transparency already is a good step in that direction. The work's already being done, you see. Professor Kimball, could you pick up on this? Well, of course, allow me to add that as soon as you have a lot of actors, a lot of interested parties in a process, that leads to longer timelines, inefficiency. The compromise is that, yes, of course, you want transparency, you want greater access to information. Of course, as scientists, researchers, we're always complaining we can't get our hands on the information easily enough. I've worked on the BIA. I've published money on how monies are sent down and used. But all said and done, we don't have access to timelines, to the detailed financial data, so it's difficult for us to really evaluate what's good and what isn't on a comparative basis. For example, take a fighter jet procurement process. We see that in Canada there are more delays compared to other states in this type of procurement, meaning there's something in the system, but what is it? You need a deeper analysis, a deep dive, for which we need more data.
Merci.
Norman Dean, Ms. Matheson, 6 minutes.
Thank you to both the witnesses, and I think this might be a question for both of you, but as Ms. Norman Din was talking about that, and you had commented before on that transparency, slowing things down, time restraints, and so on, can you talk about how that is impacted by, as we move from an open source contracting position to sole source, and certainly there are give and takes, but what are the major, is it the same kind of, I guess, not complaint but concern in terms of those timelines? And I guess Mr. Lagacé, you could go first.
I'll give a simple example. So, for instance, if what we've seen comes to fruition, that the government moves forward with the sole source acquisition of the P8 for the CMMA, one of the best ways to ensure that there's understanding and trust in why that decision was made was far greater transparency about the requirements and why that decision is made the way that it's made. If there's a lack of transparency around sole sourcing, as we saw with the fighter jets, that breeds political controversy, and that ultimately breeds delay. And this, at the end of the day, if you cannot explain why you have done what you've done, if you simply tell the public that this is what you're doing, and as when I was on this panel previously, my mantra, and it continues to be my mantra today, explain, don't tell. Explain to us why you're doing what you're doing. Then, as opposed to simply announcing it, that's what breeds distrust, and that's what creates delays over the long term.
Professor Kimball?
I would say for sure that the people that are drafting these contracts with the defense sector need to have a kind of a better aspect or a better understanding of how these risks arise before the negotiations, and the fact that they can actually integrate appropriate responses within these agreements themselves. For example, penalties, cost sharing, flexibility. The French have a very interesting thing where they have this kind of, it's kind of pre-contractual risk assessment where there's a financial obligation where the government and the contractor says, look, we agree that we're both watching for overages and we're both going to take responsibility if there's overages. And so really you have to have a shared sense of responsibility and transparency for this to work, but it can work and has actually helped them make their defense procurement more streamlined and actually prevent overages on some major projects. So Canada can do some little things, but what it needs to do is it needs to have the defense sector be more open to designing better contracts. It's about the fact that those contractors have private information, and, how do you get over those structural issues? You need better designed contracts. Solutions are available, but Canada just doesn't put those into practice.
That transparency then, because there's an argument that could be made by potentially other countries that if you go with a sole source, even if you're open about that, even if you provide explanations as to why, that they may be disillusioned by that entirely and just not want to bid at all. Is that a potential concern?
I mean, I think the other thing is that the public doesn't understand that the defense market is not a real a normal classic market as in Adam Smith, where prices are kind of supply and demand, right? We have this very bizarre market. And so when we talk about all of these things, we're essentially, our abstractual conceptualization is on a market that doesn't exist in defense. We need to change our thinking so that we understand this market so we can react appropriately to it. And frankly, a lot of these things that we see, these recommendations, are on this perfect market that is not the one that we actually work in defense procurement. And that's another thing where, frankly, there's not very much reflection about what that means. So economists have thought about this quite a bit.
Sorry, does that include, and so this unique market. In the previous panel, I'd asked the Auditor General, the Americans are going through the investigations on exorbitant costs, the fact that certain overcharges have been made by companies that I guess would be within that streamlined system, I think that you were talking about, Professor Kimball, of being a trusted defense contractor, but some of those profits are hiked up 40 to 4,000%. How do we ensure that we avoid that?
I just want to be clear. What I was talking about in that instance were not the large end defense contractors that are changing the market. Those changes to OTA authority were about small businesses. This is the market where Canada wants to be. You know, we're not Raytheons, we're not Boeings, we don't have any of those, right? And so that's the essential thing, is that those changes were about kind of permitting access for the level and size of firms that we expect Canada to be competing in the market. Now, the issue in the United States is you have these huge monopoly, actors that shape the market in ways that are not normal. But you can react to this with better contracts. You can react to this with more responsible ways to engage those actors. And so maybe I wasn't clear, but for sure, there is more and increasing attention to the fact that there are major players that are distorting the markets. And frankly, you know, some countries like France and Australia are a little bit more clear and transparent into how they deal with these things than Canada has. You know, it's been a bit of a ignoring that it's going on.
You're pretty well out of time, and you really don't want to ask a question in the last 10 seconds, do you? Excellent. Thank you. Mr. Bazan, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I want to thank both Professor Lagasse and Professor Kimball for their recommendations. I think having recommendations come forward from witnesses is important, and I just ask that you be able to provide those in writing to the committee along with your reasoning with that, so something we can actually take a hard look at. And both of you saying, I think in some cases, same thing, but in a different way. You know, nimble versus being too rigid in procurement and contracts. And Professor Lagasse, you talked about having more of that senior management that we're kind of missing out on. Are you talking within CAF itself or within National Defence or interagency, having that skill set?
Well, let me break it down. So within the CAF, one of the challenges that you have is that the requirements are being written by people that are cycling through postings fairly rapidly. The staying power of those people, given the CAF rotation system and how they are reposted after a certain period of time, that removes the memory even from individual projects, and oftentimes in the past has resulted in situations where the requirements, there isn't that good understanding of how the project is tracking over time. So that's something to be aware of in terms of how the CAF sets requirements. Then at the upper levels, in terms of the materiel group, you simply need people that are experts in this, and you need to hire more of them. But as we all know, any sector of the economy, it's the same. These aren't people that you take off the shelf and just put into a position. This takes years to train these individuals, and as some of your members mentioned earlier, you're competing with many other industries. And to be frank, this isn't simply a procurement problem. This is a cyber problem. This is going to be a problem when it comes to training personnel, maintenance personnel, whatever it is. We are facing a wall when it comes to the human resource challenges in defense, senior management, technicians, project officers, and even within the CAF.
So there's some of that we can go and hire, though, like big projects we're going to need some really good skill sets. So there should be somebody riding herd on service combatants, for example, and somebody riding herd on the F-35 purchases. And these are long-term procurements. We just can't have the deputy minister looking at this, on a Friday afternoon and saying, okay, we'll keep proceeding. We need somebody making those decisions slightly lower down, but on it 24/7.
Hey, I'm not worried about those big projects. CSC and Future Fighter have tons of people dedicated to them. I can only tell you how many years the Air Force committed to Future Fighter and the resources that were put in it. The bigger problem is the smaller projects that don't get the same level of attention. Those projects, the ones that you may never have heard of, GBAD, DRIMIS, some of these other projects that are in the system, that you want to be sure that you have the people that are there to shepherd them through the process and that they have the time and dedication to make them happen. The big rocks are...
On those smaller ones, though,
yes.
If we want to drill down and making sure that they move through more rapidly but still have that skill set, should we then, make sure that, certain, right now I think the threshold is D&D can go and spend up to $50 million without having to go through Treasury Board. Should those thresholds be increased, and should those still be capsulized within the Department of National Defense rather than spread out over Treasury Board, Procurement Canada?
The extent to which we can raise those thresholds, and similarly, the more that we can delegate some decision-making to lower-level individuals within the procurement process, again, that is the only way that you're going to speed up. It's the only way that you're going to be able to meet the pace of change that's being set. But again, that comes with risk, and we need to be able to accept that some mistakes will be made, and we can't allow every mistake that's made in good faith to blow up. Otherwise, we end up back with the future fighter. We end up back with those scandals. We're always going to get back to step one with every change in government if every single small problem that occurs leads to scandal. And we have to accept that if we want the CAF to take risks and we want them to go faster, we have to accept that on occasion there will be shortfalls.
I think I agree with you. Professor Kimball, you're talking about and comparing to the United States and other countries our procurement system. And so if you look at what we have here in Canada, are we using all the tools in our toolbox, like the Defence Production Act, making sure that you already mentioned contracts, but how do we go forward to streamline the process? And what role does our domestic industry play in making sure that we have sovereign capability during times of conflict so that we aren't getting moved to the back of the line?
Very briefly, please.
Yes. So I would say that, one of the things that's important is that, Canada needs to do a little bit of prioritizing in terms of, what its essentials are. And so, we talked a little bit about the types of projects that get a lot of focus, these big end projects like Joint Strike Fighters, and frankly, the other things that don't get very much focus, like, for example, equipping the soldier. I don't know how long I've listened to, female forces members complain about how poorly the uniforms fit and how they're really lacking some of the various necessities that they actually need to do their job. And so, that's readiness, right? Readiness means we have to go out in the field. And so I think that that's one thing that's very important, is that there needs to be kind of a reconceptualization when we look at procurement and say, okay, if we want the soldier to fight, it needs this kit, and this is how we need to prioritize that. When we do NATO, when we do NORAD, it is these capabilities that are required. And I know that there's some thinking going on about what different packages would look like for crises and missions in a more systematic, conceptual way. And I think it's important that Canada think about that when it thinks about procurement down the line.
Okay, we're going to have to leave the answer there. Thank you very much. Mr. May, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My first question will be to Professor Kimball. Previously, it was noted that since Canada has a relatively small industrial defense base, procurement may be challenged by focusing too heavily on purchasing domestically. Do you agree with that?
Yes, there's a bit of let's focus on purchasing, but I think one of the things Canada doesn't do well enough is thinking about how it can go and do R&D with other countries in a collaborative way, right? So how it can kind of work in the line towards producing those things that are sold. If you look at what Canada does, it does not do very much R&D that leads to its own projects. What is interesting now, we have Finland and Sweden joining NATO. These are countries that share Arctic space with Canada, that will definitely have some of the same needs for procurement. And so this is where I would say, yes, these are countries that have better, more efficient procurement systems. So these are ways Canada, could get more by putting in less of an investment, but also kind of secure a future line of, assets. And this is the type of stuff I think Canada can do better and should do better in the next 5 to 10 years.
So you kind of touched on my next question, but how can, and maybe elaborate a little bit more on what you were talking about there, but how can Canada take steps to better balance that need for, efficient, agile procurement with the goal of increasing domestic capacity?
Mm-hmm. I think it comes down to, looking at the types of defense industrial sectors where Canada, right now has key capabilities, and deciding these are the ones that we want to kind of foster. These are the ones that we want to develop. Looking around and saying, these are sectors that are maybe complementary to sectors and that other partners might have, and really thinking a bit more transversally about what it can do with others to kind of, find a niche in a market where it can say, okay, look, Canada and X countries do this very, very well, and these are going to be the go-to countries. Right now, Canada doesn't really have an identity like that. though it probably could, because, people think about Canada, they think about the Arctic, they think about the North, they think about the cold weather equipment. Why are we not on those lists? And the Swedes are, and the Norwegians are. These are questions that have a lot to do with how it's organized itself and how it's prioritized the types of things it invests in.
Thank you, Professor. Professor Lagacé, with several departments involved in defense procurement and layers of policies and process, do you have any recommendations for how procurement can be more streamlined, agile, and responsive to emerging military requirements? And maybe more specifically, can you identify where regulations and process may be doing more harm than good?
So you're all familiar with the difference between Vote 1 and Vote 5 money. And as soon as something engages Vote 5 spending, it engages all the processes that are required for a capital acquisition. And that means when you're trying to buy something, let's say like a new computer system, you're trying to go through a 15-year process and you're setting the requirements within the first 5 years, and then you're buying something 10 years later. Now, that's not going to work. So you need something between Vote 1, which is kind of like everyday spending, and Vote 5, which is investment spending, for high-level technologies and things that have to be procured on a rapid basis. You need this almost a middle category of money that is understood that it is spent with rapidly developing requirements and spiral requirements, such that every year or every time you're buying something, you can buy the latest thing when you need it. And right now, this categorization that we have between Vote 1 and Vote 5 doesn't allow for that flexibility.
Professor Kimball, same question to you. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I mean, in terms of the details of the process, I think I would not have much to add other than what my colleague said, because he understands the process on the inside far better than I do in terms of timing. But I would say, like I said, comparatively, it's a long process for things that we see produced quicker in other countries. And as somebody who looks at these things more largely in terms of internationally, I keep having questions and not finding very many responses.
Thank you to both of you for appearing today.
2.5 minutes, Ms. Namadine.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much. Ms. Kimball, I'd like to get back to something that you mentioned, Professor, to the effect that we need better contract design, that we might be able to better follow costs if there's overshooting delays and so on and so forth. I wonder if there's something that may trip us up when it comes to national security, intellectual property, information that's kept somewhat secret. It seems to give a certain amount of leverage to businesses when they negotiate their contracts. Am I mistaken? Are there a number of issues like that that keep us from getting better contracts? Generally speaking, questions about information required by PSPC aren't necessarily tripping up the contract. It's possible that once the process is launched, there are the things that turn up. That's in the terms of reference. It's kind of like what sets in when you're setting up the contract. But as for the framework, the structuring of the bargain, the deal that you enter into with the contractor, there's nothing that's really classified, generally speaking, and you can add a number of different clauses and provisions that aim to protect Canada, but also to protect the costing. We know that Canada has changed requirements for some of its programs. If we do this in the future, we'll pay more. Canada might accept responsibility for changing its opinion because, we'd understand that would slow things down if we change our minds halfway through the project. So both parties would be able to respect this and get into this type of contract that is more sensible. It shouldn't necessarily lead to headlines right, left, and center, though. I understand that things would have to take place quickly at the very outset when a project is signed on to, having these sort of safeguards for the project, how it will go forward. Often we think that things will be negotiated later down the line, the benefits for Canada or for the company, but I understand it must be negotiated at the very outset. yes, at least have some ideas down on paper, certain percentages and so on. This is found in other contracts that I've analyzed. I'm in the process of analyzing a number of contracts right now, actually. And of course, there are strategic reasons why the Americans and others don't want that type of approach. But if you've got a contract, you've negotiated it, right? So you negotiate and you say, we want this to protect ourselves. And you sign on to that, onto a risk analysis. This can be added to contracts. It's done so in France, for example. In Great Britain, to some extent, not as popular there, but certainly popular in France and in Australia.
2.5 minutes plus 10 seconds.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So, Ms. Kimball, Professor Kimball, we were talking about that 2%. It's that arbitrary number that everybody seems to focus on. However, you had mentioned, of course, that there is that qualitative approach that we don't take. So, and I would really love for you to expand on that around the issue that you brought forward in terms of women not having the equipment that they need that fits their bodies, that protects them actually adequately, or the story that just came forward about our troops in Latvia having to buy their own helmets because they didn't have what was necessary to keep them safe. Can you expand and talk about how we work that into a qualitative approach on the spending that we do?
Okay. First, on the helmet story, I think that has been shown that might not have actually been factually correct when it was released to the media. So I'm not sure if that's actually anyways, I would put an interrogation point next to that. When it comes to the idea of equipment and the fact that, and I'm speaking not just about women, but I'm also talking about LGBTQ people. The fact that we want to recruit in our military forces, and we don't give kit, we don't have options for people that are, I'm somebody that's non-binary, and so for me, I would have a huge problem in our military forces, evidently. And just that is a whole other story that I could speak to, because I work a lot with the Defense Pride Network, and so I know a little bit about what those individuals face trying just to defend our country. But on the part of the kit that's for women, one thing is it's very clear that this industry is an industry that's dominated by men. And when it comes to everything from prototyping, when it comes to everything from how we test things, the latest CanSec conference, there was one female mannequin of all of the mannequins that were putting defense equipment. And so I think that says a lot about the sector in general. And I know that, for example, there are some countries that are thinking about this and have put money towards developing resources for women in ways that are much more impressive. For example, the Danes. If you're pregnant and you're in the forces, you're not destined to wear a uniform that is one of the ugliest things on the planet that makes you look like a tent. And so some of these things I think are pretty important when it comes to just creating forces that are representative of society, but also this recruitment piece that is extremely important for the future of the forces.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there. Ms. Kramp-Nyman, 5 minutes.
5 minutes, thank you. Dr. Lagacé, first question, is it fair to say that D&D needs more agility when it comes to Treasury Board regulations and procurement?
Absolutely.
Perfect. Next, could you speak to, you spoke of efficiency being the key and the lack of continuity to shepherd projects through. Could you elaborate on that point a little bit?
Well, one of the challenges that you have when you're dealing with large projects is that the current posting system places people from operational postings into capability development within the forces, and there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, on a conceptual level, you're taking people who are just operators and you're putting them into the development of requirements. But then when you add on top of that, even the senior levels of the forces that will change rapidly over the life of a project, and you can imagine how as people change, requirements can be rethought, different different ways of looking at the problem, and that therefore leads to projects that experience that you basically have turnover within the project when you're trying to get it through. So as much as I respect the philosophy behind the posting system within the military, we have to recognize that itself can impose delays because you're changing the people that are effectively responsible for telling you what you need to buy.
Okay, perfect. And earlier you touched on an answer from one of my colleagues, and you mentioned how we're lagging behind our allies. Could you speak to what we're doing so wrong that other countries are doing so right?
I don't think any country is doing anything so right when it comes to procurement, but at the very least what they're doing is they're being far more transparent with their public and their parliaments about why they're doing what they're doing and how they're trying to do it. As many of you know, the Canadian tradition, we have a culture of secrecy here. We have no idea how budgets are spent. Even your work is constantly hampered by lack of information about budgets. One other point that we can point, you should all have access to classified information to do your jobs. And you do not need security clearances within the executive to do so. You are members of parliament. You have the privilege of that information. You can be sanctioned by your houses if you choose to use that information inappropriately. It is essential for you to do your work. Even when it comes to something like procurement, you should be able to have the classification or access to classified information to know exactly where projects are, what they're doing, and where the money is being spent. And that should be a non-negotiable. I can't believe we are not there yet. Just look at your colleagues in Australia, just a publication that just came out in February saying that their intelligence committee has to be replicated for defense, because if you're going to do something as serious as AUKUS, you need members such as yourselves to be cleared and have access to that information.
Awesome. Perfect. Thank you for that. Bingo. Next. Back in 2010, you spoke about the insurance of, or the importance of Canada's military capabilities able to respond to any given conflict. Sort of like an insurance policy. The higher risk you have, the more you need to contribute to that of defense numbers. So given the current state of conflict abroad, do you believe that our current capabilities would allow us to respond as needed if the situation were to escalate?
It depends on the situation, but generally speaking, the Chief of Defense Staff has pointed this out. We are very stretched as it is. Now, there was an ambition within the 2017 policy to have concurrency of operations for us to be able to do two major operations at once. We are strained to do this. We simply do not have the personnel to do this, and our recruitment and retention numbers are simply not where they need to be and make that possible. So let's leave aside equipment for a second. If you don't actually have the people to use the equipment over the long term, that equipment is useless. Capability is not simply equipment. Capability is people to use the equipment, people to maintain the equipment, people to prepare to buy future equipment. And if we are so solely focused on the hardware, we lose track of the overall picture. And as my colleague, Professor Kimball, pointed out, if you are not making every effort to include everybody who could possibly join the forces and make this a career that they want to do, you will not be prepared for anything that we're going to be thrown at in the future.
I agree more. So if basically if we don't have people, the readiness problem completely remains. There's no argument there. Can you let's go back to your last answer just a few moments ago, and I really believe the importance of Canada being proactive instead of continuously reacting. Could you answer with regards to AUKUS, should we be a member?
I would be, if I were Australia and I were the United Kingdom and Canada said I would like to join AUKUS, I would ask, what do you bring to the table? If you have nothing to offer, why should they offer you anything? If you're the smaller members, the United States might be willing to, but why would the Australians or the British give up contracts to Canadian companies? Why?
Thank you, Ms. Cramp-Diamond. Mr. Souza.
Thank you. I kind of want to build up on that point, actually. And I'm going to ask Dr. Kimball first. So we often hear about the fact that Canada may be lagging behind, this 2% commitment, especially from other NATO countries, rather large NATO countries with huge economic benefit from some of this activity. What is the trade balance between Canada and other NATO countries in regards to the military industry? Do you have a sense?
Well, of course, there's only about 6 or 8 maybe militaries in NATO that are the militaries that one would consider sufficiently capable, the ones that are kind of, the ones that are looked towards. And to this, we would add the Finns and Swedes who are coming in as another extremely capable military. And so I think one thing that's going to be extremely important is going to see, and I think Canada can have a real role in this, helping to integrate these two countries much more clearly. Canada should be inviting them to participate in the battle group that they lead, for example. This could only help Canada in terms, because we know Canada is already having some pressures there. And so, obviously, we're looking to, the big three, which would be the French, the Germans, the UK. Those are all militaries, larger militaries that are similar sized or where you have similar levels of investments would include militaries more like the Dutch, the Spaniards. And so when you look at NATO, one thing that I want to, that's extremely clear is that Canada is the only country that's not a top 5 contributor that's leading a brigade. So it's doing something with a much smaller economy that is equal to everybody else. And so when people say Canada is not, pulling its weight, it's simply, that is false. Canada is also the only country, is the country leading a brigade which has the largest variation in capabilities. If you look at all of the other groups, those countries on average have a higher level of capacity. Canada has the most partners, the most languages, and the broadest level of capacities to deal with. And so, frankly, it's putting forth something with a much different set of tools than everybody else and still managing to pull it off. And so the question is, why isn't Canada reaching 2%? The question should be, how is Canada doing as good as it's doing at 1.39?
I want to ask Doctor, if I may, if I have time. So to build up on that very point, you have some of these substantive countries limiting their 2% of GDP, which includes military industry. And Canada is not really benefiting from exporting of their military. So can you give us a sense if we are or not really affecting a positive contribution to this, to the cause?
Oh, Canada is one of what I would call the fighting few. Right? There are many countries, as we saw in Afghanistan, that are willing to contribute, but they're not necessarily willing to fight. They're not really necessarily willing to fight without caveats. We are willing to do a number of things that other members aren't willing to do. We are willing to take risks and take on operations that others weren't. So if you look at the current crisis, we helped train the Ukrainian forces that are doing the defense of their country. That was a key contribution that we made. So none of this is to denigrate what Canada actually does and the amount that we place on our forces. What I will say, though, is that the Canadian Armed Forces always seem to manage in spite of how few resources and how little support that they get. Eventually, they will snap. There will be a crisis. They will fail. And maybe that is the only moment at which real change will finally occur. But I don't think many of us appreciate the extent to which the department and the forces go out of their way to avoid failure at all costs and the strain that puts on people. And that can only be sustained for so long, as we're seeing with the procurement system. You can only push people so far before the system starts to eventually collapse.
Do you have any examples of things that were done effectively in terms of procurement in the past decade?
Oh, there's
and we can take lessons from?
There are tons of procurements that move forward that are fully successful. We just never hear about them. I would say a good 75% of procurements move through. It's the big rocks that get a lot of controversy, that generate a lot of attention. The reality is we do buy quite a bit on time, not necessarily on schedule, but we do buy it. And we focus so much on the negative that it does lead to what Professor Kimball noted, and I'm even a part of this in a sense, that when we focus only on the failures, we end up putting more and more process to control on the failures, and we have built up so many controls around the process that there's now no room for speed. And so every single time there's a scandal or every single time there's a problem, our solution is always to pile on more oversight, more controls. The problem in Canadian defense procurement is not the lack of oversight. It's, in a sense, too much of it. And I mean, I say this as somebody who was involved in that oversight.
You're saying, or the chair is being very mean, Dr. Kimball, yes, and I really want to hear from you.
Yes. Yes, crotchety, cranky, et cetera, but, at 5 to 6, and I might be persuaded for a moment or two to hear what Professor Kimball has to say and to finish off our conversation.
I mean, I would just close by saying that, obviously this is a complicated labyrinth of an animal defense procurement. It's clear that there are various recommendations that can be implemented that would help facilitate clearer contracts, that would help facilitate more transparency. There are ways in which data could be more available to scholars so we can help to evaluate this better. But I think at the end of the day, it comes down to those people that are in uniform that need to be ready. And how we recruit and retain those people. And I think that in that aspect, one of the things that we frankly haven't talked about very much at all is the education and the professionalization aspect and how that is essential to all of this. This is also an area where, frankly, there is a lot of work to be done because there are a couple of institutions that have monopolies on defense education, and I think we need to think about that in a different way. Other countries are doing it differently. And so I would leave saying that, one of our procurement problems is in that education line and getting people psyched about defense and about contributing to defense. And, the next big challenge in procurement is going to be green defense procurement. And we don't even know how we're going to do that. And we've got to do that in the next 5 to 10 years.
Thank you, Mr. Souza, for manipulating the clock like that. It was very, very clever of you. This is an extraordinarily complicated conversation, and I appreciate the contribution of both of you. I do take your point, though, Professor Lagacé, about the level of secrecy, the culture of secrecy around here. It does make it extraordinarily difficult, and the consequence of excessive secrecy is that politicians react the wrong way to misinformation, and that's something we could actually deal with. I think we could have a conversation among ourselves about that very point, because we are running to the point where we can't continue to do what we're currently doing. Something needs to change. Colleagues, we are set up for Friday, and next week we're taking bets as to just exactly how long the clerk will receive your bet as you walk out the door. With that, we're going to adjourn. Thank you again, both of you.